everyone. My name is Daniel Ksepka, and I'm the curator of science at the Bruce Museum in Greenwich, Connecticut. I'm here to talk to you about my very favorite group of polar dinosaurs, which is the penguins. And I'm speaking to you from storage room number 2. This is where we keep the natural history collections at the Bruce, things like meteorites, minerals, fossils, and of course taxidermy birds. And you'll have to excuse our appearance today because we're undergoing a renovation. The wall behind me is actually going to be knocked out pretty soon, and we're going to expand this space so we're better able to store and study our natural history treasures. So one of your first questions may be, why are penguins being included in an event called DinoFest? Well, as we all know, birds are descended from theropod dinosaurs, and penguins are, of course, birds. And so it's perfectly fair to say that penguins are living polar dinosaurs. Another great reason to talk about penguins today is that they have a remarkable fossil record. In fact, one of the best fossil records amongst birds. So to begin our talk, I thought I might introduce the penguins that we have with us today. And so behind me we have an emperor penguin and a king penguin. These are two of the very largest species and two species that thrive in very cold climates near and in Antarctica. But there are actually many more species of penguins around, and they're distributed throughout the entire world, or at least the entire southern hemisphere. Today, there are around 18 species of penguin recognized, and that answer actually differs depending on who you ask. These little illustrations show the variety of penguins we have around today. And there's a little bit of debate about, for example, whether rockhopper penguins from different parts of the Indian and Atlantic Oceans belong to the same species or not, and so whether you split them into species or not. But what we can say is there's a great diversity of size and shape and appearance in penguins. Some of them have these beautiful yellow crested plumes like the macaroni penguin. Some of them have wonderful markings like the emperor and king. You can see here the beaks of these animals actually fluoresce under UV light, in addition to having this really striking orange pattern that we can see with our own vision. And they range from the emperor penguin, which stands about 3 feet tall, to the little blue penguin, which is only 1 foot tall and weighs about 1.5 pounds and is my favorite candidate for the cutest bird alive today. Now, penguins also have a really remarkable fossil record. One of the unique things about them amongst birds is there's actually more extinct species of penguins known than there are modern species. So there's about 50 different species of penguins that have gone extinct that we have good fossil material for, and that number is growing all the time. And this is one example. This is an image of Spiniscus megaramphus. This is a penguin that lived about 5 or 6 million years ago in Peru, and just a beautiful, remarkable skeleton. And we have lots of fossils from penguins of this quality. We also have fossils that are only a single bit of bone, but all in all, there are tens of thousands of individual penguin specimens that have been discovered throughout the southern hemisphere. The reason that penguins have such a good fossil record is actually twofold. One is that they have very dense bones. So I'm holding here the wing bones, or I should say the flipper bones of a modern penguin. And these bones are much heavier and more solidly built than your average bird. Flying birds tend to want to reduce their weight to make it easier for them to fly, and therefore they're often quite hollow and very delicate, and they don't stand up very well to things like erosion once the animals died. Penguins, on the other hand, have the reverse problem. They actually want to reduce their buoyancy so they'll be able to more easily sink in the water when they're trying to swim around. And so their bones tend to be very solidly constructed. If you broke this penguin flipper bone in half, you'd see it's actually completely solid rather than having a large hollow center. And that makes them heavier and denser, more resistant to destruction, and also more likely to sink to the bottom after a penguin dies. And so if you're a penguin and you happen to bite the dust, there's a decent chance you'll sink to the bottom of the ocean and be covered by sediments and make it into the fossil record. Whereas if you're a bird that lives in an environment like a forest, you're probably out of luck. You're very, very likely to be scavenged or have your skeleton decomposed before it can become fossilized. So I guess a really good point to make before we start looking at the fossil record of penguins is to take a look at what the Earth was like when the first penguins evolved. The earliest fossil penguins we know are 62 million years old, which is really incredible. To put that in context, the asteroid impact that wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs happened about 66 million years ago. And then we have the oldest penguins at about 62, and these are the oldest we found. There may actually be older penguins. In fact, we suspect there are. And then the oldest members of our own human lineage, the oldest fossil records from our own human lineage, are only about 7 million years back in time. And so it's right to say that penguins are about 10 times older as a group than we are, and that they evolved much closer to the age of dinosaurs than they did to the age of humans. And so here's a map of what the continents would have looked like during the Paleocene when the first penguins were around, and you can see it's quite a different world. Sea level is much higher, and that's because there's no permanent polar ice sheets. So penguins reached Antarctica about 55 million years ago, and at that time, there were actually forests growing on the continent. It's a much greener world. There are many differences in the way the continents are positioned. You can see Australia and South America are still in contact with Antarctica, for example. And we find fossil penguins from all over these southern continents. In fact, any place where a penguin lives today, there's a very good chance there's a fossil of older penguins at that same location. We found them in places like South America, Australia, the Chatham Islands, New Zealand, Antarctica, and many other smaller subantarctic islands. And so the distribution of penguins always seems to have been in the southern hemisphere. We have no instances of a fossil penguin occurring above the equator. And in fact, all living penguins are restricted south of the equator with one notable exception, and that's the Galapagos penguin, a little fellow that makes it just a tiny bit north of the border. And so we see them on the Galapagos Islands, really just a few hundred yards or a couple miles north of the line. So as it happens, the oldest penguins are not from Antarctica. And that's kind of surprising to many people because we tend to associate penguins with these cold Antarctic environments. But in fact, the oldest fossils that we know of come from New Zealand. And these penguins are about 62 million years in age. And that's really important because that shows that penguins first evolved in an ice-free world. They were living at a time where there were no permanent polar ice sheets. And so these penguins would have been in a world with higher sea level, much warmer ocean temperatures. And they're not at all associated with these extreme environments. And so, although it's very impressive that animals like the emperor penguin are able to thrive in Antarctica, that's an adaptation that came much, much later in their evolutionary history. So here's a photo of the oldest penguin. This is Waimanu manneringi. These are the bones superimposed on an outline of the body. And on the left of that, you'll see an artist's reconstruction of what the animal might have looked like when it was alive. And so it's quite a beautiful creature, I think, and it's telling us a lot about kind of the transition from being a flying bird to being a penguin. If you look at the Waimanu illustration, it kind of reminds me of a cormorant, one of these aquatic birds. I actually have a specimen of that right here. The differences between Waimanu and modern penguins include the ability to fold the wings a little bit, much like this bird is doing here, and a longer, more slender beak, kind of like a cormorant. So those differences would really set it apart from what we kind of think of when we think about a penguin. But at the same time, there's a lot of similarities. Of course, it's flightless. That's the most important one. It has a flipper already. And additionally, it has this short little stubby leg bone. So it probably had a foot and leg, much like my friend the king penguin here. And that means it would have had that kind of interesting, kind of endearing, clumsy waddle when it was walking around on land. Now, New Zealand has yielded many other fossil penguins in addition to Waimanu. It's actually what I consider the fossil penguin capital of the world. And I've had the chance to do some field work there, and it's a great treat to be able to go to these really unique environments and look for fossil penguins. So New Zealand has a long geological history, and during a time when many of these early penguins were around, the high sea level led to large parts of both the North and South Island being submerged. And that means on land today, there are a lot of deposits that were once on the ocean floor. And those are great places to look for fossils of things like whales and seals and penguins. Now, one of my favorite penguins of all is Kairuku. This is a very large fossil penguin that I was able to work on with Dr. Ewan Fordyce, who's a professor at the University of Otago. Here are some bones of that penguin, and this was just a huge animal. So this is the tibia tarsus, that's basically the shin bone of a modern rockhopper penguin, and here is the same bone from a Kairuku penguin. It's not actually even complete. We're missing the top part. So you can see this was a really remarkable animal. And we find these animals in really interesting environments. So when we think about paleontology fieldwork, we tend to think of people digging into the ground to excavate fossils. And actually in New Zealand, there are many sites where you'll be digging into the side of a cliff instead of down into the ground. So here's a picture of myself and Dr. Daniel Thomas. He's a professor at the University of Massey in New Zealand. And here we're excavating a cliffside fossil site. And so that kind of square hole next to me is where fossils been cut out of the soft sandstone and siltstone of this cliff wall. And here's another photo. This is showing what it might look like when you first stumble upon a penguin here. So you're walking along the edge of this cliff, which has been eroded down by a river, and this orangey thing projecting out here, that's actually a penguin bone exposed in cross-section. And it's got this orange color because it's been exposed to oxygen. It's kind of almost rusting, so to speak. So the iron in that bone is getting stained as it oxidizes, and that really makes it stand out against the greenish sedimentary rock. So if you saw something like this, you might decide to dig around a little bit and see if there's more bones behind it, and maybe it's something worth bringing back to the lab. So Kairuku is just a remarkable penguin. It's one of, I think, the coolest animals that ever lived. And this is a photograph of my colleague, Dr. Fordyce, who collected a lot of the original material of this in his lab. And here he is with those bones. You can see what a massive animal this was when you lay the skeleton out. It almost looks like you've got a human skeleton laid out in front of you. And on the left of that, there's artist reconstructions of both a living yellow-eyed penguin, which is a native species in New Zealand, and Kairuku. So you can see it was a big animal, about a little bit taller than 5 feet tall, so probably about up to here on me, and weighing somewhere on the order of 200 pounds, a really impressive beast when it was around. And here's some artwork of Kairuku by artist Chris Gaskin, and you can see it's just a beautiful penguin. The skeleton indicates it had quite different proportions than modern penguins, a much more slender and elongate body, a longer, pointier beak, and actually, unusually, shorter legs, and so it would have had these interesting kind of tapering appearance. It would have been a beautiful animal to see, but it also would have been an animal you probably didn't want to get too close to, because at that size, with that sharp, pointy beak at the end of its head, I don't think you'd want to approach its nest, for example, because it would probably be able to knock you right over at 200 pounds. Another very important place for fossil penguins is the coastline of Peru. And this is just remarkable. It's almost a contradiction because it's one of the driest places on Earth. And so Peru is home to deserts that receive less than 2 millimeters of rainfall a year. But right off the coast, there's just amazing diversity of marine life. There's upwelling currents that are bringing cold, nutrient-rich waters up to the surface. And this feeds things like shrimp and krill and squid, which in turn form prey sources for animals like sharks and dolphins and, of course, penguins. And so if you're on the coast of Peru today, you might encounter a Humboldt penguin actually holding an egg of a Humboldt penguin from our collection. And they do just fine in this very hot, dry environment because they're spending all their time in the water, and they don't really have to worry as much about the temperatures on land, except that they need to make little burrows to keep their eggs cool enough when they're nesting. And so Peru is home to a remarkable record of aquatic organisms, and that's because the forces that are uplifting the Andes Mountains are actually throwing former ocean floor up onto the surface. So this is an image from some field work that I was part of back in 2010, and what you're seeing here are vertebrae from a whale that are eroding out of the ground. And so when you're walking around in the desert of Peru, it's pretty much like you're standing on a 30 or 40 million year old seafloor. You'll see things like shark teeth, whale bones, and if you're really lucky, penguin bones, just where they were buried tens of millions of years ago. And some of the penguins that have been discovered in Peru are I think, some of the most interesting that have ever been found anywhere on Earth. So here I have a little flipper bone from that Humboldt penguin, that species that lives in Peru today. And this is the same flipper bone from Ecodiptes, another giant species of penguin. You can just see the remarkable size difference here. This was a penguin that lived in Peru about 34 million years ago. And what's fascinating about Ecodiptes is its skull. So here's an image that shows the skull of a Humboldt penguin and the skull of Ecodiptes. And this was basically a spear-billed penguin. You can see here it has this remarkably elongate and pointed and very solidly built beak that we believe allowed it to impale its prey, which may have been soft-bodied fish and squid. And there's a little reconstruction of what that animal might have looked like next to a modern Humboldt penguin. So it's very big, but I think what's much more interesting is the bizarre morphology of the skull that would have given it a diet unlike any modern penguin. Another remarkable penguin from Peru is Incayacu, and that's a species whose name means water king. And this is the only fossil penguin that preserves intact fossil feathers. So these are 34 million year old feathers. and they can tell us some really interesting things about what this bird looked like and how early penguin feathers evolved. So the first hint that Incayacu was something special came when Ali Altamirano, a student in Peru, stumbled upon this foot eroding out of the ground. So what you're seeing here is a fossil foot, and the scales are actually still intact. So on the lower right, you can see the foot of a modern penguin, and above it, the fossil. So just having these scales alone is really remarkable because soft tissue like skin tends to degrade pretty quickly, leaving only the bones behind. So most of the fossils we have are only skeletons. Rarely, though, soft tissue gets preserved, and that's really special because it can tell us something about parts of the animal we don't usually get to see. And the scales were very important, but more important were the feathers. So if we look at our friend, the king penguin here, it's actually a very soft animal, and that's because it has thousands and thousands of feathers that form these layers that both insulate the animal and make it waterproof. And these are called contour feathers on the body, and then on the wings we have what we would call, in a normal bird, flight feathers, and they're actually very different in penguins and other birds. So if we look at our friend the cormorant again, you can see that the wing feathers are very elongated, and that helps make up the airfoil that allows these animals to fly. In penguins, those feathers have been greatly reduced in size, so there's dozens of little flight feathers here, but they're all very small and scale-like. And that is important because reducing the length of those reduces drag, and so penguins have evolved a totally different type of flight feather that's more efficient in underwater locomotion than those of modern flying birds. So when we looked at these Incayacu feathers, we were just blown away. And so this is an image from a paper led by Dr. Julia Clark that I was a part of, along with Jakob Winter, who's an expert on the subcellular structure of fossil feathers. And what we can see here is beautiful preservation. This is a contour feather or a body feather, and you can actually see the individual barbs that branches from the shaft of the feather, as well as even evidence of color gradation. So you see that feather kind of darkens towards the tip, just like the feather of a modern emperor penguin. What's even more remarkable is that we can figure out the color of these feathers. Even though the original color is long gone due to fossilization processes, we can look at microscopic evidence for that. So here's another image of some of the flight feathers or wing feathers from Incayacu, and if we look at them under a scanning electron microscope, these are blown up about 10,000 times in size, you can see these little round objects. And what these are melanosomes. They're subcellular organelles, tiny structures that carry pigment. And Dr. Winter really pioneered this field of looking at the shapes and aspect ratios of these melanosomes to figure out what color fossil organisms were. And so if we look at our friend the cormorant one more time, at these black feathers, and black pigments tend to be made of something called a eumelanosome. These are elongate structures. They look kind of like microscopic hot dogs. And so if you find that type of melanosome, you can indicate that the animal is probably black in color. Now an animal, for example, with a reddish-brown color, like this little red knot, would have a different type of melanosome in these feathers. And this would be something called the pale melanosome that's more rounded. It would look more like a microscopic M&M, I'd say. And so looking at these structures can help you piece together the color patterns of an extinct organism. And I have to admit, when we first started looking at them in Incayacu, I was sure it would just be black and white like we always expect in penguins. But surprisingly, a lot of the body feathers, the feathers that would have been along the trunk of the animal, turned out to have evidence of gray pigmentation. And the underside of the flipper, which tends to be black and white in modern penguins, actually had evidence for this reddish-brown color. So something very unique is going on here. Here is an artist's reconstruction of what Incayacu may have looked like, and it's having very different patterns, and we're not exactly sure why. It could be related to different foraging. Maybe instead of having black and white counter shading, it's living in a murkier water environment where having a all grayish red body, like a seal or a sea lion, may have been more efficient at camouflaging it from predators and from its prey. So we've talked about fossil penguins from New Zealand and from Peru, and it wouldn't be right to have a Polar DinoFest talk that didn't cover a little bit about fossil penguins from Antarctica. And the funny thing is, although penguins are quite common in Antarctica today, they form colonies with tens of thousands of individuals, they're actually pretty rare in the fossil record. There's only one place we can actually find fossil penguins in Antarctica, and that's Seymour Island, which is on the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula. And that's not to say that penguins haven't inhabited Antarctica for tens of millions of years. It's just very hard to find places where the rocks that have the appropriate age fossils in them are not completely covered in ice. And so Seymour Island is a very windswept place, and there are thousands of penguin bones known from there, but most of them are in pretty bad condition like this one. So this is a piece of a penguin humerus. It's broken into a couple different segments, and these bones are kind of being eroded out of the ground and damaged by wind and dust and things like that, freezing and thawing. And so although they might look like pretty fragmentary material, they're very valuable to people like myself who are interested in the microstructure of penguin bones. So if we look inside penguin bone in cross-section, it's very different than that of a normal bird. Here you're seeing a penguin bone, a femur bone, the thigh bone of a penguin, compared to that of a pelican. So most birds have very hollow bones. They're filled with air spaces that helps make them more lightweight, which is a big advantage when you're flying. But penguins, again, have that opposite problem. They want to reduce their buoyancy so it's easier for them to move through the water column. So they tend to have what we call osteosclerotic bone, very thick-walled bone that makes them denser and heavier. I'm really interested in tiny chips of fossil penguin bone like this because the microstructure of bone can tell you a little bit about how an animal grew when it was alive. And the thing is, if you have a complete fossil penguin flipper bone like this and you ask a curator if you can section it, to cut it up, to look at the microstructure, they're almost certainly going to tell you to get lost. But if you have little fragments of bone like this, especially if there's hundreds of them, it's very likely that they give you permission if you ask nicely. And so what we do is we embed these bones in a little epoxy resin, we cut them with a saw, and then we polish them so they're smooth, wafer-thin little pieces, and we look at them under a microscope to get an idea of how the animal was growing before it died. Penguins, like all birds, hatch from eggs. This is an emperor penguin egg, and they grow to adulthood generally very quickly, so this egg would give a little tiny baby, and it would grow to about the size in a couple months. Now, depending on the environment you're living in, it may make sense to grow continually or not. If we look at robins in our own backyard, for example, they basically grow rapidly to adulthood over the course of a few weeks. So if you have baby robins hatch in your nest in the spring, you're not going to come back next year and see little toddler robins and then come back a year later and see teenage robins, and then a year later they finally become adults and left the nest. No, they grow really, really quickly, and so they'll be fully adult and ready to fly and be on their own just in a couple of weeks. And that's true for most birds. But the bigger you get, the harder it is to get that big before the end of the year and to do so without paws. And so some animals, like the king penguin, actually do take a break in growth. And so king penguins live in some pretty extreme environments, and the male and female will take turns both incubating the egg and caring later for the young, for the hatchling. And they're bringing it back food so that it can grow, and they're kind of neglecting themselves during that time. But eventually it comes to a point where the parents need to go back to sea and forage to replenish their own food stores. And at that point, they actually leave the young alone for a couple weeks. And during this time, they survive off the fat layers they built up, and they stop growing. And while they've stopped growing, they actually lay down a line of arrested growth. This is basically a tree ring, but in bone. So if we look at this image here, you can see a king penguin starvation lag, or line of arrested growth. And this is a signal that gets recorded in the bone that documents that time period where that animal was not eating and was surviving off that food and had stopped growing. So I was actually hoping to find lags in some of these giant fossil penguins like Kairuku, and we looked at quite a few, and we actually found no evidence of any lines of arrested growth. And in addition, we found reticular bone structure. So if we look at this particular microstructure in this image here, the Haversian canals, the canals that bring nutrients to the bone cells, are arranged in a manner that we call reticular bone. And that's indicative of the highest growth rates we see in vertebrates. And so that suggests that these big penguins grew really rapidly to adulthood and didn't have any type of paws like king penguins do. And so that suggests their parents were able to feed them continually until they reached adult size. And so it would have been pretty cool to see some of these giant baby penguins begging for food from their parents, and especially when they were in that like kind of fluffy plumage that the babies tend to have. So I'd like to say thank you very much for inviting me to be a DinoFest speaker. And if you'd like to know more about fossil penguins, I have a blog called March of the Fossil Penguins. It's fossilpenguins.wordpress.com, and you can learn more about all of the species we talked about today. And I'd also like to invite anyone in the Connecticut area to come see our penguins exhibition, which will open in the latter half of 2022. Thank you very much.